Joining me live and exclusive on the Newstrack is one of the world's leading vaccinologists, director of the Serum Institute at the Oxford University, where this AstraZeneca vaccine has been developed, Professor Adrian Hill. He's the Lakshmi Mittal and Family Professorship of Vaccinology, director of the Serum Institute, co-director of the Oxford Martin Program for Vaccines, has worked before this on the Ebola vaccine, the malaria vaccine, is an expert on immunology, vaccinology of infectious diseases, and he's just the guy we need to speak to when the Indian government has granted approvals to these two vaccines for an independent perspective, outside of what we're hearing from companies in India, outside of what we're hearing from the government in India, for an independent global perspective on the vaccine rollout. Professor Hill, welcome to India Today.
Thank you.
Congratulations. This is a big day for you and your team at the Serum Institute, and for India, the first approvals coming through formally. How confident are you that the vaccine that you and your team have developed so painstakingly is the solution that the world has been waiting for?
Well, we have a lot of advantages with this vaccine. There's going to be a lot of it available, tens of millions of doses already today, manufactured, ready to go, and much of that in India. We're also very confident that this will be distributed at low cost. This is a non-profit vaccine, so the price of it will probably be lower than most, if not all, other vaccines. And it's pretty simple to deliver. You can store it in a refrigerator. You don't need a freezer or deep freeze as with some other vaccines. And all of those advantages should play into what's most important now, which is really rapid deployment.
How does your vaccine, Professor Hill, compare with Moderna and Pfizer? I ask this because the Indian government says that the Oxford University vaccine has an efficacy of 70%. Moderna and Pfizer are claiming 90 and 94.5. To a layman, that would suggest that the Oxford vaccine isn't quite as efficacious as the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. Is that a fair reading of the data?
I think that's over-reading rather limited data that are not directly comparable. So let me explain. There are three things that you would like a vaccine to do against COVID. Most importantly, most people think, is to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And the very good news is that all of the vaccines you've been mentioning, including the AstraZeneca vaccine, are very close to 100% in terms of their efficacy against severe disease and death. And that's, I would argue, the most important feature of the vaccine. It's not the easiest to measure. It's easier to measure clinical cases, most of which are fairly mild. And that's the number that you have been quoting for Moderna, which is of the order of 90 to 95%. For the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, the efficacy against mild COVID depends on how you use the vaccine. In other words, do you give a single dose where the efficacy is 73%, or do you give two doses at a long interval, maybe 3 months between the first and the second, which we're now seeing is giving higher efficacy? And that makes sense to us because the immune response is stronger if you have a 3-month interval between the first and second dose. So many regulators are taking the view that that might be advantageous. It's easier to deploy in an emergency setting if you don't have to give the first and second dose within a few weeks. And finally, the third thing you like a vaccine to do is to prevent transmission. That's much harder to measure. Can you measure whether the vaccine is stopping people who are vaccinated giving the virus to other people? And we have preliminary data on that, which suggests that that is possible as well. So I'm afraid it's a complicated picture in terms of exactly how these vaccines compare. The trials have been done somewhat differently, but the really good news is that all of them are very highly effective against severe COVID and death.
You just mentioned that the AstraZeneca Oxford University Serum Institute vaccine has higher efficacy when the gap between the first dose and the second dose is 3 months. How does it then compare? If the gap, when it's 28 days, the efficacy is 70.2%, when the gap is 3 months, in the trials that you've been conducting, what is the efficacy that you're picking up, and when will these trials be made public and peer reviewed?
So one of those, well, we have many groups in the trial that we have undertaken in the UK, in Brazil, and in South Africa. Some of those groups, as we have reported, you can see efficacy as high as 90%. With other regimens, it may be more like 80% with the 3-month interval. And as you say, these data are still being acquired because the more groups you have in a trial, the smaller the numbers you have per group have to be. But, you know, we're not particularly concerned about whether it's 80% or 90% or 95%. What we're primarily trying to do here is to end the pandemic, stop people dying, and those are endpoints for which the vaccine does look very effective, particularly against severe disease. And of course, there was an attempt some months ago by WHO and others to have head-to-head comparisons of these vaccines. That proved to be very difficult. It has not happened yet. So I think we have to accept that these vaccines are all pretty highly efficacious and very useful to deploy, and that to compare them head-to-head now would be very difficult because we're deploying the vaccines and that's the top priority.
So let's take an efficacy of 80%. Explain to common viewers what that means. Does that mean that 80% of those who administered the vaccine will then not have to worry about COVID? They won't get COVID for how long? And what does it mean for the other 20% who are not part of the 80% that get covered? Does it mean that they're likely to get COVID-19? And how severe could their bout of infection possibly be?
Yeah, very good question. What it means is that any individual who is vaccinated with that immunization schedule has an 80% reduction in risk of getting a COVID illness. Whether that's mild or severe, they're all counted in that figure. So some people will get an illness, but what they're very unlikely to get is severe COVID and hospitalization, and certainly massively reduced risk of dying from COVID is what we're seeing in the data on the numbers so far. So I think that can be reassuring. It may well be that people who are vaccinated still get a mild COVID infection, but they're very unlikely indeed, much less than a 20% risk of getting severe COVID or ending up in hospital from that virus.
I spoke to the Director General of the Indian Council for Medical Research. He says that the data before the Indian government is for dose 1 and 2 to be administered at a gap of 28 days, and that's what they will do initially. You're saying that the vaccine is most efficacious at a gap of 3 months, and I'm wondering if you're the ones who created the vaccine and you're telling us that it's best to take it 3 months later. Why are we taking it at a gap of 28 days? What is the data that you have which the Indian government doesn't have at this moment, and would you urge the Indian government then to administer the vaccine in a 3-month period? How do you wrap your head around this?
Yeah, it's not very complicated. Both the UK regulators and now the Indian regulators have said that the vaccine can be given at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks as the interval between vaccination. So the Indian government has not prescribed exactly that interval. It is, we think, somewhat better with a longer interval. It's still very useful indeed with a short interval of 4 weeks. And indeed, with a single dose, without giving the second dose at all, the efficacy is 73%. So you can see we're discussing small differences, 73% versus 80% here. The most important thing by far is not to get too tied up in what exactly the efficacy is of different vaccines, as they all work very well, and to be able to deploy these rapidly, because that's what we need to do. We need to reduce the transmission of this virus to prevent illness and end this pandemic. So the challenge now is deployment of these vaccines.
The gorilla in the cold storage room where the vaccines are stored is the mutant virus. Now, these jumps that are happening with new strains, particularly the UK strain of COVID-19, which is causing alarm not just in the United Kingdom but globally, the Indian government's assessment is that they aren't fully certain whether the Oxford University AstraZeneca vaccine provides full immunity against this new strain. As the man who had developed the Oxford University vaccine, how confident are you, Professor Hill, that your vaccine works against the new strain, or is that a grey area that bothers you?
So the first thing to say is that all of the vaccines that we've been talking about use the same part of the coronavirus to immunize against. It's called the spike antigen, and I think all the vaccines that have been advanced to late-stage clinical development or licensed all work against this spike protein of the coronavirus. The important point is that is a very large protein. We count the amino acids in that, and it's of the order of 1,200. What this mutant strain, or variant strain as we might call it, has is a very small number of changes in that very large coronavirus spike antigen of about 1,200 amino acids. Do those very small numbers make a difference? Nearly everybody expects that it will not, because the immunity that we generate with the vaccines spreads right across that spike protein. And if you have a small change here or there, it's likely to make very little difference. The uncertainty you mentioned is that the key experiment to demonstrate that there is no impairment of immunity with the variant is ongoing right now. I guess we may have a result in a week, but that's fairly straightforward to do. It just takes 2 or 3 weeks to get the data. I think most people are agreed it's very unlikely that the variant that is most prevalent in the UK is a problem for vaccination. There's another variant from South Africa that's being looked at as well. So that's why people are saying they're very confident that this should not make a difference, but we haven't got the final data right yet. That will be coming soon.
But is this a potential landmine for the vaccination program? There's now talk of the vaccine jumping from the human species to minks. We saw at mink farms in Denmark and Netherlands, the entire farm was culled, thousands of minks killed because of the fear that if it jumps back to the human body, then that would be a mutation that the vaccine would not be able to deal with. So is this essentially, in layman's speak, a ticking time bomb, that there could be some mutation, some change in the virus which makes the vaccine ineffective? It may not be the UK strain, but it could happen at some point in time.
It could happen at some point in time, but for that to happen, my guess is you would need a very large number of changes in the spike protein, not 1, not 2, not 3, maybe 20, 30, 40. And yes, that could happen over time, but you know, we've had almost a year of this virus so far, and we have nothing like that number of changes in the spike protein. It's not impossible that it could happen, it's just very unlikely. So I don't think we should be particularly concerned about that now. If it did happen, we can fairly rapidly make a vaccine with the new strain being targeted with a new vaccine. But at the moment, that certainly is not necessary in our view. What we need now is to get this vaccine into people's arms as quickly and efficiently and in very large numbers as we possibly can.
Typically, it takes 14 to 15 years for a vaccine to get approval. This vaccination process and the whole process of regulatory approvals is being pushed through in less than a year. And there are many who will be watching at this time who are wondering whether they should be the first ones queuing up to get the vaccine. Should they wait for a while, see what happens to the others, what kind of effects they have, and importantly, about long-term side effects. How much do we know? Because there hasn't been a study over a long term. There's been studies only over a few weeks and months. So what do you know about the potential long-term side effects of these vaccines?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is different for different vaccine types. Some vaccines, like the RNA ones, are very new, and they have not been followed for, say, a year in tens of thousands of people. which is what you'd like to see. For the Oxford AstraZeneca Serum Institute vaccine, we know that this type of vaccine, which has been around since the 1990s, a common cold virus vector vaccine, has been given to very large numbers of people now, either for other indications like an Ebola vaccine, we use the same vaccine type there in large numbers of individuals, or now for COVID. So just to give you a scale on this, the number of people who've been in clinical trials of this vaccine is around about 60,000. And most of those have had the coronavirus vaccine. Some have had a control vaccine or a different vaccine for comparison. But you can see immediately that there are tens of thousands of people who have been safely vaccinated, who have been followed. There have been no significant concerns on safety in any of the trials, whether they're in India or in the UK or in Brazil or in the United States or in South Africa or other countries. So I think people can be reassured by that. But you know, the only way to absolutely demonstrate long-term safety is to wait. But again, remember that most vaccines that give side effects in the few weeks after vaccination. It's extremely rare to see very late side effects turning up 2 years, for example, after vaccination. Not impossible, but very unlikely indeed.
And that's why typically, what are the kind of side effects that have been reported in the trials that you've conducted? In all the cases where your vaccine's been administered, what are the kind of typical side effects that are being reported, and how frequently is that happening?
Yes, we know the answer to that very clearly. People can get sore arms. They can get a little bit of swelling where the needle is injected into their arm. Sometimes a slight discoloration, but typically that lasts 1 or 2 days and is then gone. And in addition, you may get a fever, or at least feel feverish in the day or two after vaccination. That's generally mild. It's treatable by paracetamol or other drugs. And again, it's short-lived. It's 1 or 2 days. So those minor side effects or minor to moderate side effects occur in a proportion of people, but they are gone fairly quickly. So again, regulators are very familiar with that side effect profile. It's seen for many other vaccines, and we see it again with this COVID vaccine.
There are some Muslim clerics in India who have raised alarm about the use of pork gelatin in the production of these vaccines. They're calling for their followers to boycott the vaccine because it's not safe as per their belief. Is that true? What do you want to tell religious leaders who are raising these issues about the manner in which these vaccines have been produced, sir?
Yes, we've had input from various religions, not just Muslims, commenting that vaccines must have certain properties. And that's right. What I would recommend is to look very carefully at what is actually in the vaccine to make sure that what they're concerned about is there, because these are very purified vaccines manufactured to extremely high quality with a great deal of detail on the composition of the vaccine. And there certainly should be a vaccine that for COVID that all religions are happy with.
Have you got the shot yourself? What kind of side effects did you have? What can you share about your personal experience, Professor Hill?
No, I can't, because I haven't had the AstraZeneca vaccine myself, but I have seen very large numbers of people who have, and as I described a moment ago, those side effects are pretty well tolerated.
Okay, I am hugely curious to know why the man who's helping develop this vaccine and wanting the world to take it hasn't taken the vaccine himself, Professor Hill.
Well, we have a policy on this, as you probably know. You can have the vaccine if you volunteer for a clinical trial. And indeed, many people at the University of Oxford have, and they have been vaccinated with the relevant vaccine or with a control, and they have contributed to that large number of tens of thousands of people who have tested the vaccine. It's not generally regarded as good practice for people who are in a senior role in managing the trial to volunteer and participate themselves. So I would discourage that for people who are in a position of responsibility about a trial actually volunteering to be in that trial. And as you know, the vaccine is now licensed in the UK in the last week. It is becoming available and it is being administered first to high-risk groups. So that generally is people over the age of 80 or over the age of 90. I don't qualify for that group, and for healthcare workers. So as a healthcare worker, I will be vaccinated fairly soon, but it just hasn't happened yet.
And on one line, last question, I would wonder if you have a comment to offer on the Indian government's decision to give approval to a second vaccine candidate from Bharat Biotech. Their phase 3 trial results aren't public, they haven't been peer reviewed, but emergency approvals have been granted in clinical trial mode, which is something that some healthcare experts like Dr. Kang have questioned. Is that something that you have concerns about?
I'm afraid I don't know the details of the Bharat vaccine, but I can say generally that, look, we are delighted. The more vaccines that are approved for dealing with COVID as soon as possible, the better for India, the better for the world. And of course, regulators have this very much in mind when they're looking at the safety and efficacy data of new vaccines. So we are in a position where no vaccine can solve this problem on its own. We need multiple vaccines. We need billions of doses. If you could make 1 billion doses of one vaccine in a year, as a manufacturer, you've done amazingly well. But more than 1 billion doses are needed. So let's be clear, any vaccine that works pretty well is contributing to the solution to this terrible pandemic problem.
I'm going to leave it over there. Professor Adrian Hill, it has been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. We are delighted with the work that your scientists and you have done to produce this vaccine in such quick time. It has been a huge personal and professional achievement as well. Fingers crossed. Hope the rollout happens in a manner that doesn't produce any side effects and that humanity can bounce back from this terrible pandemic. I wish you all the best and thank you deeply for having taken out time to join us on the Newstrack. That is one of the key scientists involved in the production, the manufacturing, the science and the research behind the Oxford University vaccine that's finally got government's approval. Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kanwal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.